What if there was a drug that could cure everything? And what if there was a group of people who wouldn't stop at anything in order to make sure that this drug never reached the general population? Sound interesting? This is Common Side Effect, a new adult cartoon premiering on Adult Swim. Per the synopsis, it follows former high school lab mates Marshall and Francis as they unravel a conspiracy involving Big Pharma and the government to suppress knowledge of a rare fungus that may contain the solution to cure all of the world's diseases. Not only does this sound like a pretty interesting concept, but from what we were shown in the trailers, this show seems really good. And it's for this reason that many people were excited for its release. Because, unlike many other adult cartoons which just have very vulgar humor, this seemed like it took a completely different direction. An adult cartoon that focuses on things that people actually care about, having interesting characters, a really interesting story, and animation that honestly looks pretty good. And stuff like this is really rare because many times adult animation is just a lot of vulgar comedy. It doesn't have this cool in-depth story that people can really grasp onto, which is why you're going to see in many comment sections people saying that this show is probably going to save adult animation, which honestly, they may be right, because if this show is as good as many people hope it is, then we could have a new trend of adult shows that are focusing on things other than vulgar comedy. This may actually bring in a new wave of adult animated cartoons. But we may be putting the horses before the cart, because first, the show actually has to be good. And so, let's actually see. The first episode of the show is dropped, so does this show live up to the hype, and will it actually save adult animation? The only way to prove that is to actually give the show a watch, so let's get into it. And of course, there is no better way to start than by going over Season 1, Episode 1, the pilot episode. The episode begins with us seeing the CEO of Ryutical Pharmaceuticals, Rick, who is giving a speech about a new drug. And as somebody who has sat through many presentations from drug companies, yes, this is incredibly accurate. After giving an absolutely abysmal speech, he opens the floor up to questions, which is where we get introduced to the main character of the series, Marshall. Marshall immediately begins bringing up the destruction of the environment caused by the pharmaceutical company and is escorted out, but not before being recognized by one of his old classmates, that being Francis, who actually works for Ryutical Pharmaceuticals. And as a quick side note, I would implore you to take a closer look at the background art in this scene. Not only is everything painted as to give depth to the scene and make our main character stand out, but also there are some absolutely hilarious faces. But getting back to more important things, Francis and Marshall do eventually end up meeting up, with Francis hiding the fact that she works for the pharmaceutical company. While they're talking, Francis mentions that Marshall was supposed to have died in a plane crash, but Marshall says that his death was greatly exaggerated. And so to catch up, both characters do end up going to a park. Something to note about these scenes is that the character acting and the conversations feel so natural. It doesn't feel like people are just spouting off exposition, it feels like two people are actually meeting up after not having seen each other for a really long time. The best way that I would describe this voice acting is that it is imperfect. There are a lot of stuttering, there's a lot of weird takes and lines that in normal conversation makes a lot of sense, but usually in a cartoon, you're going to see a bit more polish to it. But it's pretty clear that this is the direction that they were going for, and I think that because they have such natural sounding conversations, a lot of the interactions between the characters and the relationships that we see just feel more real. And so, moving back to the conversation, we get a bit more insight as to who Francis is, and we end up finding out that her mom is suffering with dementia, a chronic disease that usually medicine can't heal. And of course, having a heart-to-heart moment with her, Marshall ends up revealing that he had found a drug that can cure everything, and this is where the true plot of the story kicks in. During the scene, we actually do get to see the miracle drug in action, and I really appreciate the way that they introduce it because it is a pretty shocking and grotesque scene. During their conversation, Marshall picks up a pigeon, breaks its neck, and then heals it with the drug. The scene is very brutalistic and very surreal, but I think that one of my favorite portions of it is the reaction that Francis has. She doesn't over-explain that he's killing the bird, and she also doesn't go in this completely crazy over-the-top shock mode. And throughout the entire thing, we see that Marshall's emotions are keeping calm because he understands that he can fix what he broke, which of course leads into how the drug actually works, and the representation of how this medicine truly interacts with a person and brings it back to its primordial state basically is really cool. For starters, the art style of the show is beautiful, and the environments and the backgrounds are really what's supposed to grab your attention. The characters look a bit off-putting, but that's on purpose. It's supposed to invoke a sort of uncomfortable feeling within you, and it does a great job at that. We also get a lot of really good good use of transitions. You probably didn't notice while watching this, but there are a ton of flash transitions between the scenes that just help it flow better. And I think the final thing that I want to bring up is the transition of frame rates, which is something that I noticed right away when watching this show, and something that I encourage other people to keep a lookout for. From what I've seen from the first 2 episodes, it seems like the frame rate changes to a more smoother 30 frames per second when they're trying to get you to focus on something important. Like at the end of the sequence where the pigeon is flying off, that is obviously at a higher frame rate in order to signify its importance. But moving on, right after Marshall is able to bring the bird back from near death, we actually see that somebody's been watching him, and that somebody is a government agency. And of course, because Marshall has a drug that is able to cure everything, he's the #1 target for quote-unquote them. And of course, them being government agencies, pharmaceutical companies, people who benefit from others being sick and needing drugs. The scene has some pretty good commentary on how agencies will demonize a single person, embellish what they do in order to put a target on their back. And after effectively demonizing Marshall, they end up saying that they're going to put their best 2 agents on the case, Capano and Harrington. And let me just say, the introduction of Capano and Harrington may be one of the best introductions of 2 buddy cops I've ever seen in my life. Not only is the scene really funny, but it's also a really good use of show, don't tell. In a pretty short scene, not only are they able to tell us that Capano and Harrington have a really good relationship, that they're both pretty odd, and obviously that they're not the best agents that they can find. From a single scene, not only are we able to understand what their relationship dynamic is, but also it establishes that these characters won't just fall in line. They're different, they're unique, and usually characters like this will look a little bit deeper into the orders that they're receiving. After this, we get a flashback to see exactly how Marshall discovered the magical mushroom. And again, we get a really beautiful sequence in which we're not only able to intake the beauty of the world, but also we're able to see the work that Marshall put in order to actually find this. At the end of the flashback, we get a bit of exposition that this mushroom can only survive in a single environment because it needs absolutely perfect conditions in order to grow. And during the sequence, we actually get to see what happened to Marshall during the plane crash, in which he actually would have died if not for the magical mushroom, which is the only reason that he is alive today. And honestly, that's not even the most insane part, because we have to remember that Marshall did all of this, realized that people were after him, and yet the first thing he does when he's back in the city is go to a speech given by a pharmaceutical CEO in order to get them to stop destroying the environment. Marshall is a character who has dedicated his life to not only save people who are afflicted with chronic illnesses, but also to take down the pharmaceutical companies. Now, contrast this with Francis, who of course works for the CEO of the pharmaceutical company that's destroying the very thing that Marshall is trying to protect. You can tell that there's a lot of chemistry between these 2 characters, but they also juxtapose each other at times. Because here's the thing, Francis is sympathetic to what Marshall has been going through and is sympathetic to his cause. But she doesn't understand the situation that Marshall's in, and she also is pretty naive to the fact that if drug companies figured out that she has a miracle drug that can cure everything, they're not going to allow it to reach the market. A bit later in the episode, we're going to see how Francis actually approaches this conundrum, but for now, Francis ends up taking a call from her boss, which leaves Marshall alone, and because he's pretty paranoid, he ends up just going back home. After that, we cut back to Capano and Harrington, in which we get some pretty good character building between the 2. Capano, although he's pretty easygoing, is more of the analytical type. He likes to take every single possibility, and sometimes he goes a little bit too far and is completely wrong. Harrington, on the other hand, is a bit of an airhead, but compliments Capano pretty nicely. The 2 characters have a pretty funny scene, but this is basically just set up for when they eventually go after Marshall. We then cut back to Francis, and even though Rick is technically the CEO, it's pretty clear that Francis makes a lot of the decisions. It's pretty obvious from these scenes that she's a lot more competent than Rick is, but is very comfortable with her position. And in all honesty, although Francis is a very smart person, she is a bit of a pushover. As they're leaving for the day, the 2 characters do discuss how there's going to be budget cuts and how people are going to lose their jobs. And it is at this moment in which Francis tells the CEO that she may have a brand new drug for the company to sell. That's right, she wants to take the miracle drug that can cure every disease and give it to a greedy corporation. And saying it like that makes her sound like a pretty terrible person, but we have to remember that this is coming from a place of her wanting to help people. Francis cares about her job security and the job security of other people that she works with. She doesn't want the company to go under because it would affect her and many others. Take a look at this from her perspective. You are somebody who could not only make a ton of money, save the company, save people's jobs, and in the process bring a new miracle drug that can cure any disease to market. And when you think about it like that, although it does seem a bit selfish, it's honestly a pretty noble endeavor. So after she gets out of work, she tries to contact Marshall, but he's unavailable at the moment. And that's because Marshall has just arrived home, but has seen that there's movement on his security cameras, meaning that yes, he knows that somebody is watching him. And who else would it be but Capano and Harrington? The next scene gives us a bit more more exposition on who Marshall actually is, a millionaire who won his riches on scratch-off tickets, and is a very respected scientific researcher. And yes, although this is just exposition on who Marshall is, the scene just feels so real. They're not just blurting out information so that we as the audience understand it. They're having a conversation, and while they're doing that, we're getting information about characters. We also see the little seeds of dissent that Capano and Harrington are currently having about Marshall, because as they say, he doesn't really seem like a typical drug dealer. But of course, they have a job to do, and so the DEA has a search warrant and ends up raiding his house. But of course, Marshall isn't there because he's already had an escape plan. After this, we cut back to Frances and see that she has a man-child as a boyfriend named Nick, and yeah, they don't really seem too compatible. Their interactions are pretty awkward, but thankfully, it's interrupted from a phone call by Marshall, who ends up telling Frances that people are chasing him, and we get a pretty dramatic scene to end off the pilot episode. And so, with somebody with pretty high expectations, did I actually enjoy this episode? The answer is pretty simple. This was probably one of the best first episodes of an adult cartoon that I have ever watched. This was exactly what I expected the show should be. It has great comedy, great character building, and a really interesting story that just draws you in. Whoever is working on this product must have extensive experience with the pharmaceutical company or with healthcare in general, because a lot of the stuff is just so accurate. The little things like saying how one side effect is preferable over another, or trying to speed up the side effects on a drug commercial. It's the little things like that that truly show how much care went into the show. And honestly, don't get me started on the art direction and the animation because it's really good. I'll be real with you guys, the giant heads are pretty weird at first, but it grows on you, and honestly, the style actually helps the storytelling so much. Because the characters' heads are so big, you actually get to focus in on the facial expressions that they're making, and that just makes it so much easier to see what characters are feeling in certain scenes. It doesn't hurt the serious moments of the show, and also it makes the comedic moments that much funnier. And of course, the background animation and the background art is absolutely beautiful. The art direction for this show is just awesome. Overall, just a really enjoyable pilot. But listen, just because the pilot is pretty good doesn't mean that the series is going to be able to continue on with the same intensity and great storytelling, right? Especially since the episode ends on a cliffhanger, we have to see if the story is truly going to be what we're expecting. And it's probably because of those sentiments that they released the first two episodes at the exact same time. And so let's quell those doubts right now by jumping into episode 2. The second episode right away throws us into a government conspiracy in which the pharmaceutical companies are everywhere, which is how they were able to see that Marshall had eventually discovered the miracle mushroom drug. After we get immediate confirmation that it was the pharmaceutical companies trying to take out Marshall as soon as he discovered a drug that could threaten the entire economy of the pharmaceutical companies, we are introduced to a character called Jonas, an incredibly powerful shadowy figure who does not care about its constituents or the people that they are trying to quote-unquote help with the drugs that they produce. The only thing that he cares about is money and the economics of the pharmaceutical company. And so we see that this powerful shadowy figure eventually orders every government agency to try to hunt down Marshall to ensure that this drug is never able to see the light of society. So without hesitation, the people at the top have marked Marshall as the #1 public enemy. Using every government agency at their disposal, as well as Jonas's private guard, they are now going to stop at nothing in order to make sure that Marshall is dead by the end of the day. Did I mention that this show is absolutely peak? I mean, if there was any doubt that the second episode would be lackluster and wouldn't be able to keep up the intensity, the show immediately tells us that, hey, this is going to be an absolutely crazy ride. I mean, just look at the opener. Not only are they able to establish an incredibly detailed world building in which an entire civilization is surrounding bigger companies trying to make a profit, they are able to establish an environmental theming in which we see that companies do not care about the environment unless it benefits their own interests. But we also get introduced to one of the main villains of the show, Jonas. We understand his motives. We understand that he doesn't really look at things from a personable aspect and instead looks at things at a greater picture. Sure, they may be able to heal a lot of people while having this mushroom, but it may also destabilize the entire economy that civilization is based on. Think about it. If people knew about this mushroom, millions of people would lose their jobs. It's not just in the US, it's in every corner of the world. This single drug could quite literally destabilize the entire world economical system, and because they don't want to deal with that, they need to make sure that it never makes its way to market, even though this drug could cure every single disease. Although we're definitely seeing Jonas framed as a villain, we do actually understand why he doesn't want this drug coming to market and why Marshall is such a dangerous person. The destabilization of the entire world's economy or being able to cure every single disease. What absolutely fantastic theming we get in the very first 2 minutes of episode 2. And to be honest, the episode gets even better from here. After this, we cut back to the conversation between Frances and Marshall. Marshall, realizing that he's being watched, tells Frances to meet him at a local park. And Frances agrees to meet Marshall in the middle of the night at a random park. start. Now, to be clear, I don't truly understand what Frances's motivations are in meeting up with Marshall here, because in reality, there's a few reasons why she would want to meet up. The first one is to steal his drug in order to become rich and famous and give it to Rick, the CEO of Reutical Pharmaceuticals. The other option is that she genuinely cares for Marshall, and when she had originally thought that he died in a plane crash, she was completely heartbroken, which is why she ended up moving on and dating her boyfriend Nick. But now that Marshall is back in her life, she wants to reconnect. And the final possibility is that she is just completely done with her monotonous life. In the first episode, I characterized Frances as a bit of a pushover, and I think that this episode gives me even more evidence to prove I was right. We can tell from her facial expressions and the way that her voice carries that she is emotionally tired. And yet, her boyfriend doesn't pick up on that, and instead gives her more tasks to complete. Sound a bit familiar? This is the exact same relationship that she has with her boss Rick. I would characterize Frances as a very docile person, somebody who doesn't like to stir trouble, and also somebody who doesn't like to truly show their emotions. But I think that at her core, she is wanting a bit more from her life, which is why when she sees that her friend from high school who she thought was dead has an incredibly rare drug that could change the very framework of society, she wants to be a part of that. She wants to have something different. And so when we're looking at the true motives of Frances, to be honest, it's probably a mixture of all three. Wanting the glory of finding the new drug, wanting to rekindle her relationship with Marshall, and also wanting to have something more from her life. But unfortunately, Frances and Marshall's paths do not cross again in the entirety of episode 2. And in my opinion, they probably won't cross again for quite a while. We then cut back to Capano and Harrington talking a bit more about Marshall and how he doesn't really fit the normal description of a drug dealer and how they really don't think that he's as evil as what they're being told. And again, I love the character dynamics between Capano and Harrington, but I also have found myself really liking Capano in the way that he thinks about certain situations. Like in this scene, they focus really heavily on the fact that Marshall feeds ducks every day at 6 p.m. And yeah, may seem like really useless exposition about Marshall, but this is actually more so to tell us about Capano and his way of recognizing patterns. Think back to when he was first introduced. We actually saw that Capano was incredibly apt at recognizing patterns with different killings. The same thing here, he's able to recognize patterns of Marshall, and I think that this is going to be a main point of his character and why he's going to be able to find Marshall before other people. Harrington is the character that is able to memorize information, and Capano is the one who is able to put them together and to find a pattern. Regardless of what other people think about them, they are probably some of the best that the DEA has to offer. Capano and Harrington may actually be one of my favorite duos of all time. They're just great. After this, we cut back to Marshall and his turtle, who has unfortunately gotten sick. And because of that, he ends up going to meet his half-brother, who is running a pet store. The scene is supposed to really focus on the fact that Marshall's half-brother is obviously addicted to some sort of drug. And the drug has basically taken over his entire life, where he can't even function without taking one. The scene is pretty jarring and almost feels like it's misplaced with all of this action going around, but it's supposed to give us a pretty good example of how drug use has actually affected Marshall's life. And it shows us more of Marshall's motivation and why he's risking his life in order to bring a miracle drug to market. Afterwards, we cut back to Frances, who is doing more research about Marshall. She watches some of his educational videos about mushrooms and then sees a couple of the controversies that he's been a part of. But something interesting that happens before she's able to get too far into this research is that this funny video pops up in which immediately draws her attention. Seems like it's just supposed to be setting up a joke to transition to the next scene, but I actually think that they're putting this in for a more insidious reason. As to not get too deep into the conspiracy, remember that she was researching Marshall and his education on mushrooms, and yet the algorithm sent her an obvious rage bait video that completely took her attention away from the topic she was researching. Pretty suspicious in my opinion. But after this, she's actually interrupted by Rick, who tells her that he has a reservation open and invites her to a restaurant. It's not really a nice gesture though, it's just that he has somebody to complain to. And complain he does, because we actually get to see a bit of the insight into the CEO and what's going on with the pharmaceutical company. Specifically with Reutical Pharmaceuticals, they're dealing with a massive lawsuit because of the unintended side effects of the drugs that they're making. I would assume that this scene is very off-putting for people who don't work in healthcare because of the way that they're just speaking about it so casually. When Rick is talking about people losing their lives and how it is a strain on the company because they're going to lose a lot of money is very weird. And throughout the conversation, we see the difference between somebody like Frances and somebody like Rick. It's definitely a trend that people who are higher up in these companies definitely don't have the same empathy as those who are not. But I digress, because during the conversation, Frances does again bring up the fact that she has found a brand new drug. Rick tells her that if it's something that will save the company and make them a lot of money, that she should go after it. And so she eventually makes her way back to Marshall's house, which obviously really isn't a good idea considering everything that's been going on. And honestly, this decision ends up pretty poorly for Frances, because in the scene before, Marshall says that he needs somebody to go to his house, save his animals, and completely destroy all of the evidence of his research, which ends up happening, and Frances is caught within a house that is being set ablaze. She does eventually escape, but in doing so, she ends up leaving car tire tracks right by Marshall's house, which of course are found by Capano and Harrington. Carrington. Cutting back to Marshall, we see that the henchmen that Jonas sent after him eventually do find him and end up ramming his car with a huge truck. But fortunately, Marshall is able to escape and eventually gets on a train that is seemingly heading outside of the city. We then cut back to Jonas, who is having a conversation with Connor, the original person who ratted Marshall out. And unfortunately, this conversation does end in the exact way that you think it does. And yes, it's a pretty shocking development, but it shows an important lesson that regardless of how important you think you are to a company or you think you are to a person in power, you aren't, which unfortunately caused the downfall of Connor. And that is how the second episode ends. So, after watching the first 2 episodes of Common Side Effects, I can confidently say that yes, this is absolutely one of the best adult animated shows I have ever seen. And honestly, it's pretty insane that this show had not only met the high expectations that people set for it, but honestly completely blew past them. From the intuitive character writing to the subversion of common tropes is just so interesting and well written. Everything about this show has met and surpassed expectations. And so, if you were somebody who was watching this video to see if it was truly worth giving this show a shot, especially given the fact that the animation is a bit weird and off-putting at first, I hope that I've convinced you to give it a watch. People have been wanting an adult cartoon of this caliber for such a long time. So, if you guys want more series like this, make sure that you are supporting Common Side Effect. You can find this show on Adult Swim or on HBO Max. So make sure that you guys are definitely giving it a watch. But that's all I have for today. So if you guys like this video and want more, make sure that you comment, like, and subscribe down below. It truly does help out the channel. There are plenty of videos on the way, so long as I find the energy to actually edit them. But if you guys have a specific show that you want me to watch and analyze, make sure you comment it down below. And so, of course, until next time, Tanuki crew, peace, peace.